Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this episode was tailor-made. Yeah! All right, have fun, guys. All right, so when we left off in the last episode, Pater Row had been established as the center of the British Empire's publishing trade, and I was picking my way through these plump, ripe grapes that the juice was kind enough to introduce me to, starting with JJ, Kid Dynamite, and moving on to his neighbor and fellow juice publisher, George Robinson, who punted to Ozzie and Fancy Pants, and Fancy Pants' purchase of publisher and bookseller William Taylor's estate. All right, and so Taylor was big time. He was the first publisher of Robinson Crusoe, which threw up flags for me because of Robinson Crusoe's presence at the ladies' Mrs. Jarley's Waxworks party in 1872. Right, and so the gatekeepers offer nothing on William Taylor, but having given Robinson Crusoe a cursory glance, I remembered this book, right? And the more I look at the author's name, the more I'm staggered by the way the name Hutchins and Hutchison keep showing up in Mud City. It's just unbelievable. And as I said, this Henry Clinton Hutchins drops the dime on Paternoster Row when he goes into great detail about William Taylor's life and career in Chapter 2. And so, with no image for him, the role of William Taylor will be played by William Hurt, heretofore christened Big Chill, right? And I love him as an actor, but not as much as Hutchins here loves him some Big Chill and dropping knowledge about what was going on Paternoster Row in the early part of the 18th century, right? And he gets there by trying to figure out whether Big Chill was Robinson Crusoe's publisher, printer, or bookseller. Three distinct positions in the book trade prior to the publication of Robinson Crusoe, because it was around this time the power dynamics in the book trade were rapidly changing, as all three tradesmen saw the benefits that managing all the aspects provided, right? So booksellers were becoming publishers, and publishers took charge of their own printing, and printers really kind of became the stooges to the booksellers and the publishers, right? But it was chaos, and sometimes that made it very hard to tell who did what in the terms of how a physical book got made, right? Because the words bookseller and publisher were really becoming interchangeable at this time, right? But when this happened exactly is hard to determine. And after a lengthy investigation into Big Chill's publishing history, it's determined that he held all three roles for Robinson Crusoe, and reading through his investigation, it can be inferred that this transition was happening no later than 1691, which is the oldest book that he looks at, right? And so you know it was happening earlier than this. And if you were to ask me, I would say that this transition really got rolling after November 28th, 1660. But that could just be me, right? That's just pure speculation on my part, right? And this whole publisher, bookseller, printer distinction is important, right? And we're going to come back to it. Because after reading through, Hutchins offers tantalizing clues about Big Chill, right? First, in that there is little in the way of any personal or biographical information about him. There's no story of his life, description of his personality, or habits that can be given. So apparently no other publisher, bookseller, or printer, or writer for that matter, ever shared an anecdotal story about him in letters, which seems odd to me given the propensity that these people had for letter writing back then. Everybody was writing everybody and telling stories, right? But something could be shown of his position in the book trade, and that's that he was the son of John Taylor, and that he joined dear old dad in the family business in 1700, and that his father, Duran Duran, took over the business of one Benjamin Tooke, one of the dominating figures in the London book trade, right? And he was this dominating figure because Benjamin Tooke, here played by Mr. Bratt, just so happened to be King Charles II's royal printer, holding the title of King's Printer from 1669 to 1685, right? And his tenure as King's Printer was prodigious and included many government acts, statutes, proclamations, and sermons, as well as the Book of Common Prayer and these early almanacs, right? And I learned that he originally came from Ireland, but did all of his work out of his St. Paul's Churchyard offices in London, right? And he lets his sister handle all his Irish affairs out of her offices on Skinner Row.
Skinner!
Right next to the juice. right? And so it's interesting to note here, when Charlie II regained his throne in 1660, he shored up the authority of St. Paul's in the Church of England with the Clarendon Code, named after Edward Hyde, first Earl of Clarendon, right? And these laws were designed to make life very difficult for dissenters, right? And so I find it fascinating that the crown is pushing this angle right out of the churchyard, yet so many of these publishers and booksellers are pimping dissenting sermons and literature right in the same neighborhood. Something feels highly suspect to me about all of this. Like, it's just another example of all sides being the same sides, and that the choices we have out there are manipulated into place, merely creating the illusion of choice. And that these laws are called the Clarendon Codes is very interesting, of course, because, and I don't know if you remember, but the polygon was the circle to Clarendon Square, right? And so that's amazing, right? And so to start bringing it back, I think that Duran Duran, John Taylor, taking over Benjamin Took's business is a great apophonetic link to the crown and, by extension, to the Royal Society. And that Duran Duran was of a religious turn of mind, and that he was a Baptist makes me wonder just how connected Duran Duran here could be to the stories of George Keith and Joseph Johnson, known for their Baptist associations, and to George Robinson, whom I speculate could be an Anabaptist, right? And so it's really crazy how the Baptists have just sort of jumped their way into this story, right? Just like the way the Mormons did back in the day, right? And that the Baptists were dissenters made me wonder if these Taylors could be related to these Taylors, to Richard Oil Lamp Taylor and his dissenting Unitarian family, like his grandfather John, right? But since there is no genie information about these Taylors, there's no way to know if they're related. But there's definitely something going on with these Taylors and the publishing bookselling arena around St. Paul's, because while trying to connect these families, I found a third Taylor that had his hands in the game. And wouldn't you know it, his name is John, right? Noted publisher of these poets, John Keats and John Clare, right? So more Clare madness, right? And he would have been a contemporary of Oil Lamp and all of these people. And so this John Taylor, he's also a very interesting guy, right? His father was also a printer bookseller who pawns him off to James Lackington as an apprentice over at Finsbury Circus, before he and fellow Lackington apprentice James Hesse strike out on their own and open their own shop on Fleet Street, putting two Taylors on Fleet Street. And again, Fleet Street extends, so I don't know how close their shops may have been, but if I'm the Oil Lamp and I don't know this guy, I'd be pissed, right? He's encroaching on my territory. But regardless, this John Taylor publishes and writes a couple of amazing books, including The Great Pyramid, Why It Was Built and Who Built It, published by Fancy Pants' descendants in 1859. Right? And most of these publishing firms were family affairs, passed down from generation to generation, of course, right? And in this book, he argues that pi and the golden ratio may have been deliberately incorporated into the design of the Great Pyramid, right? And it's his book that kicks off pyramidology, even though he never actually goes to the Giza Plateau or ever sees the Great Pyramid with his own eyes, which is very interesting, right? And so I wanted to look into it, and I found out that, as far as I know, that the earliest measurements of the Great Pyramid happened as early as 1646 by this J. Greaves in his Pyramidographia, right? And all of this is interesting because if you look at the Giza Plateau today, it looks like this, right? But in the mid-1800s, it allegedly looked like this, right? And this is allegedly the earliest known photo of the Great Pyramid, dated 1839. But it does seem to indicate how deeply buried the Giza Plateau was at this time, if you put any trust in these photographs, right? Because the next oldest photo I found is this one, allegedly dated 10 years later to 1849. And I keep using the word allegedly because the next one is dated 1860, yet appears more buried than the previous one. And this is the next one, dated 1878. Right? So are you trying to tell me that it took them 18 years to dig this out? That just doesn't seem right. Right? And so I have to question just how accurate any measurements made at this time could have been, because this is supposed to be some 20 years after John Taylor's book, which again was published in 1859. Right? And so to show what Greaves may have been working with in the late 1600s, I found this drawing allegedly from 1610. And so it looks like nothing was done in the way of excavation in the 250 years between these images, if you can believe that. right? But I'm not here to speculate on the Giza Plateau or the pyramids, other than to say that I think of them as just another attraction in the amusement park terrarium that I call Mud City. But apparently this John Taylor, hereby christened Pharaoh John, learns enough about the Great Pyramid that he never saw with his own eyes to conclude that the pyramids were not designed by Egyptians, but instead by an Israelite, and perhaps they were designed by Noah himself, who was never an Israelite. But that's amazing, right? But learning about Pharaoh John while searching for Duran Duran John Taylor and the Big Chill, and knowing that at least at one time, Pharaoh John here had a shop on Fleet Street at the same time as the oil lamp, I wanted to know if these Taylors were related, right? Because we already know that the oil lamps family came from Norwich, right? But according to the gatekeepers, Pharaoh John wasn't from Norwich, but instead was from, and this is unbelievable, he was from Nottinghamshire. Are you kidding me? Nottinghamshire, where the Poes and the Byrons and Sherwood Forest is? Right? And if that weren't crazy enough, this thing Charlie's way the hell out there, right? I don't know if you remember this, but this bout of tailor-made madness came by looking into George Robinson, neighbor to Kid Dynamite on Paternoster Row, through his associations with Fancy Pants, who bought the publishing book-selling business of Big Chill after he died, right? First publisher of Robinson Crusoe. But this gets even better because George Robinson has a brother who is also a partner in his book-selling concern, right? And his initials are on most, if not all, of the Robinson title pages that I looked at. But this is all there is for him, right? Just his initial here. The gatekeepers offer me nothing. Just learning that this J stood for Joseph took some serious digging, right? Because there's no mention of the A-Team even having a brother on his wiki page. And so with nothing to go on, I'm sure you can imagine my utter shock and delight when trying to find out anything on Joseph, he who furthers the Robinsons. I came across another Joseph Robinson who was from, of all places, Nottinghamshire, in the right time period with no known parents or siblings. And these Robinsons are all over Nottinghamshire and Lincolnshire, where the Disneys were from. This Joseph Robinson's grandson is buried there. And so now my fat senses are going crazy. And this is where the Charlieing begins in earnest, because remember, we don't know anything about George Robinson's childhood, not where he's from, not who his parents were, or that he has a brother at all. Could this George Robinson be from Nottingham? At the same time, Pharaoh John's family is there, right? And though I couldn't directly link the Pharaoh to either of these Taylor families, Oil Lamp coming from Norwich and the Big Chill and his father Duran Duran coming from parts unknown, but having all of these Taylors from Nottinghamshire makes me think I'm onto something, right? Because I can connect both of these Taylor families to the A-Team, who would have known them through the bookselling and publishing trade. He clearly knew who these Taylors were because everyone did. Less clear is how well he might have known the Oil Lamp, who would only be just starting out on his own when the A-Team's life plan ceases to come together in 1801. But he was kicking around as an apprentice before then, so it is more probable than not that they knew each other. Just as it's more probable than not that the A-Team also knew the Oil Lamp's father, Unitarian hymn writer John Taylor, right? Rocky Mountain High, who pimps his hymns around to the publishers on Paternoster Row and surrounding neighborhood, which definitely connects him to Kid Dynamite and 90210, who launched the first Unitarian church in London on April 17th, 1774, which is down here. And I have Baalta Rome's Unitarian church as the stand-in. How is the Church of England okay with an upstart competitor knocking on the door, right? And having all its literature and hymns published right in its shadows? It just doesn't make sense to me. But this is exactly what's happening in Baltimore 50 years later in 1822, right? With the Basilica and the Church of England and the Unitarians sharing this prime real estate in Baltimore. Like they're all chums. And so I think this is a good time to remind everyone of Unitarianism's origins in, of all places, Transylvania. So add Dracula to the list of universal monsters this story is touching on. And I love that Unitarianism has so many Gnostic specific conceptions, like the monad, the great architect, and the demiurge. Praise Yaldabaoth, right? But it also has possible ties to Islam, as we've discussed before. So all this going on in the shadows of the Church of England is made possible by these three guys, who are also very deeply involved in radical progressive politics that looks to change how the human race the fragile fractals see themselves. And I think a direct link can be shown to how far back this program runs by looking at the First Unitarian Church in Baalta, Rome today and its proximity to the Church of England in Baalta, Rome. And let's not forget about what's going on over on the other side of the Jones Falls, over here at Hopkins, right? And all that this means to the story, right? And with these two churches, the Unitarian and St. Paul's in Baltimore, being so close, both here and there, and how these Unitarians are set up in England by Kid Dynamite, publisher of the liberally progressive William Godwin, the Juice, whose baby mama, the Undertaker, was a Unitarian. I just don't know what to tell you if you can't see the connection from here to here, and even more specifically to here, which is of course just an extension of the Crown's authority, right? To Mud City, this is clear as day, right? And there's so much more, right? Because Rocky Mountain High here spins out the Charlie Day Paradigm Puzzle Tree Apophenia board in all kinds of directions. Because aside from Oil Lamp, he has 6 other children, right? And you can't have 7 kids without at least one baby mama, right? And so Rocky Mountain High is married to one Susanna Taylor, right? And here she is. And apparently she was quite the hostess, as their home was a radical social gathering hosting these influential people, including another Robinson, whose clickbait I'm ignoring here, as well as I'm ignoring this Macintosh guy, right? But he says that the house was a haven, in quotes, and describes Susie as intelligent and knowledgeable. And of course the Taylors were supporters of the French Revolution, and so therefore Jacobin, just like the Juice and the Undertaker and Kid Dynamite, etc., and etc. And so apparently Susanna was so supportive of the French Revolution, her close friends called her Madame Roland, a French revolutionist she was said to look like. And so let's take a quick look. I'm not really seeing it, so we're going to go with that. It's inconclusive, right? But this Madame Roland has a pretty amazing story, and she ends up losing her head over her alleged loyalty to the French royal family on November 8th, 1793. And so in Mud City, it could be possible that the lovely Marie Jean here got the Marie Tussaud treatment, and that Susanna Taylor may in fact have been the real Madame Roland, right? I know it's a bit of a stretch, but I like that idea. Because to Mud City, Madame Tussaud was definitely sneaking out high-ranking French royal family members after staging their executions. But this is about Susie's children, right? And we already know about Oil Lamp, right? Who goes on to be one of the preeminent publishers of scientific books and journals, right? But there are 6 others, right? And it's just amazing how blessed this family was. And first up, we have the eldest son, who of course is named John, right? There are just so many Johns, right? And he led an amazing life, right? Which I'm just going to go through real quick, right? So he was a mining engineer, most specifically copper. And when he was just 17 years old, he invents a mechanized copper ore crusher, which is adopted by the mining industry. And at 19, he was made manager of the copper mine in Tavistock, Devon. All right, of course, more Devon, and then there's Tavistock. It's just unbelievable. Where he also oversees the construction of the Tavistock Canal. Right? He also sets up a chemical plant and a sugar refinery, and he develops a type of natural gas from decomposing animal oils that helps get the gaslighting trade up and running, right? And he was a fellow of the Royal Society, right? And so seemingly he's a very rich, powerful, influential copper baron. But apparently he was really just an agent of the Martineau family from Norwich, right? Who I cannot chase down right now. They were Huguenots from France, right? And so next up in the Taylor family, we have Edward the music writer, right? And he kicks around a lot. And he was briefly sheriff of Norwich before he moved to London to work with his older brother, right? But it isn't happening for him there. And so when he's 43 years old, he says, fuck it, and decides to go into the music business, right? He likes to sing, and he had a little musical training when he was a kid, right? So he takes the leap. And wouldn't you know it, he's instantly successful. He starts arranging musical programs for the city of Norwich and its churches, right? And as a member of London's Masonic Lodge, Taylor wrote a Masonic glee called Here's to Sussex, Our Master. I think that's very interesting. And he parlays himself into the very prestigious position of professor of music at Gresham, right? And he publishes and delivers many lectures on musical subjects, including English vocal music. So tack music, one of the greatest tools our controllers have, to the Taylor family list of their publishing and mining concerns, right? All right, so next up, we have Philip, right, civil engineer. And he also kicks around his older brother's business, working in the mines and at the chemical plant, where he deals with the pharmacological side of things as a chemist. But he finds his most success when he gets into the steam engine business. And he and his company patent many different steam engines, including an early piston engine that quickly becomes the standard, right? And they sold these engines all over England and Europe, setting up steam engine factories and empowering whole nations with steam technology, railroads and steamboats and things like this, right? And he also develops a hot blast process that makes the manufacture of iron more efficient. And so, in terms of what our modern narrative tells us about the Industrial Revolution and the importance of iron and steam technology, it's hard to find a more important or influential guy that you've never heard of than Philip Taylor. It's just amazing, right? And the last Taylor sibling that the gatekeepers say anything about is Sister Sarah, who is a translator, right? Mostly from German to English. And her wiki page credits her with doing much to make Germany familiar to the English. And I say just in time, too, right? Because the Germans have only been sitting on the British throne for over 100 years by this point. The English should be getting familiar with Germany. And so her wiki page is actually quite lengthy, but translating is really her thing, right? And she translates and writes some very interesting books. But what really blows me away about her is who her only child was, right? She was the mother of Lucy, Lady Duff Gordon. And she was a gifted child who quickly and fluently learned the German language her mother loved so much. And she becomes a translator herself. But being an only child and traveling a lot with her parents, she doesn't have that many friends. And perhaps that she wore snakes in her hair might have had something to do with that, and that her mother considered her a bit unmanageable, and she was considered a potential homicide by a friend of the family. What does that mean? That people wanted her killed? This is unbelievable. But her childhood did include having the elderly Jeremy Bentham, founder of English Unitarianism, take her around his garden in an activity that they called, in quotes, antiprandial circumgyration. Right? What on God's green earth is antiprandial circumgyration? I don't know about you, but it sounds a bit creepy to me. But, Lady Duff's story really doesn't get going until she meets her husband, Alexander Cornwall Duff Gordon. And they meet at a society ball held of, in all places, Lansdowne House, the home of the Marquis of Lansdowne. Right? Are you kidding me with this? Right? This Lansdowne thing is just insane. Right? Because remember, there's a Lansdowne place across the street from the Polygon, where the Juice and the Undertaker and young Mary Shelley and even Chucky Dickens lived. All right, so now I don't know if Lansdowne Place and Lansdowne House are one and the same, but my fat senses are telling me that it's so. And to Charlie this thing out even further, the Juice is tight with Lord Byron, whose middle name is Gordon, after his mother's family. And so those Gordons go back to Aberdeenshire, right? And this is Lord Byron's grandpappy. And wouldn't you know it, Lucy's husband's Gordons descend from the Earls of Aberdeen. Coincidence? Maybe. But there are a ton of Alexander Gordons in Lord Byron's family tree. And to tighten this connection a little further, one of Lady Duff Gordon's daughters, Janet Ross, who has an amazing story filled with famous writers and scientists. When she was a young girl, she was invited by Charles Babbage to check out his difference engine, right? And Babbage's assistant and first computer programmer was Ada Lovelace, the difference maker, the only legitimate child of Lord Byron, right? I told you, Ada goes deep. And so, yeah, I think a case can be made that Lady Duff Gordon's husband, Alexander Cornwall Duff Gordon's family are related to Lord Byron's Gordons. And we'll be seeing more of Lord Byron before this is all said and done. And so bringing it back to Lucy, I think it's fun that given her name and her family's Unitarian background and Unitarianism coming from Transylvania the way that it does, I think it's fun that Dracula's first English victim in Bram Stoker's novel is named Lucy, right? But as fun as that is, it's not as fun as the book she's most famous for writing, a little book called Letters from Egypt, right? And it was published by the Macmillans in 1865. All right, so you see, she's 18 years old, and she marries an older, rich banker who has banks in Egypt, right? So they move to Alexandria. more Alexandrian connections to this story, a la Edward Daniel Clarke and his Suit of Lies, right? But while in Egypt, she becomes British correspondent to a few newspapers back home, and she writes a ton of letters to her friends and family detailing her life in Egypt, her travels, the people, what have you, right? And I have to ask myself, how much of what we know about life in Egypt in the mid 1800s comes from anecdotal sources like these versus from the people who were truly living it? But it's curious to me that this book would become so popular, and I'm looking to connect all these publishing tailors as the same family because she's writing all her correspondences, whether it's for the British newspapers or for her friends and family, at the exact same time that Pharaoh John is prepping his book and having it published. It's enough for Mud City to link these families, however apophonetic it may seem, right? And so what is going on with all these tailors, right? Because another connection hit me while looking into this. And if you think things have gotten Charlied so far, just wait, right? We got a long way to go with this story because I have to bring it back to Rocky Mountain High, John Taylor, right? The Unitarian hymn writer, patriarch of this incredibly diverse and influential family. Because it turns out that writing hymns is a side hustle for him, and that his daily trade is in yarn manufacture, and that he teaches the local paupers to spin yarn, earning many thousands of pounds, which would translate probably to millions of dollars today, for his parish, which of course he's the treasurer of. And in this process, he also restores the family fortunes. And so I'm thinking, what? He's earning all of these thousands of pounds and restoring his family fortunes through slave labor, right? Because that's what training the paupers to spin yarn sounds like to me. I don't think he was paying those paupers. And reading the term spin yarn brought my mind back to the original yarn spinner himself, EAG's grandfather, David Poe, who made spinning wheels and clockworks, right? And knowing the Poe ties to Nottinghamshire and to the Hidden Hand, and now having a tailor from there and a tailor that makes yarn, old Charlie is telling me that their stories are connected, that maybe these tailors are connected to the Hidden Hand too, right? And maybe all of these publishers as well, right? Because one thing I want to point out is that being in the yarn manufacturing business would make these tailors drapers, right? And so with so many surnames being occupational in origin, it makes sense that this tailor family has its origins as tailors, right? It's just vowel swaps happening here, right? And this could also demonstrate how easily one worshipful company could infiltrate another, perhaps solidifying control over multiple worshipful companies. And just for fun, right, merging these companies by precedent, the Drapers being 3rd and the Stationers 47th, which as I said is a coded 11, right? You could get a 33 from this if you were so inclined, which is pretty incredible, right? And so to close this one out with an absolutely amazing cherry, we need to switch it back to Oil Lamp's grandfather and Rocky Mountain High's dad, Preachin' John Taylor, who has ties to the Nottingham area when he takes charge of that extra parochial chapel in Lincolnshire used for nonconformist worship by the Disneys, whatever that means, right? And so another tentative connection to Pharaoh John's tailors, perhaps, right? But the real topper here is that Preachin' John's daughter marries Sir William Edward Parry's uncle, Edward Rigby. And so William Parry is most famous for his search for the Northwest Passage and search for the North Pole. And so if you're thinking that they're lying about the shape of this realm, then think about how responsible a person like William Edward Parry, Fellow of the Royal Society, could be in erasing this map and others like it that show Mount Meru and other land masses at the North Pole. Right? And that's not to say that this map is real either, but it could be. And so being able to tie a possible cover-up like this to the Taylors who have ties with the Disneys and all this publishing and music and steam engines and copper mining is just unbelievable. Right? And to put a cherry on top of a cherry, William Edward Parry was born in Bath, Somerset, location of Lansdowne Hill, where Sir Bevil Granville was mortally wounded. All right, the Norse code cannot be denied. Thank you. There's so much more I could have done with these tailors, and there's more to come with them. There's more to come with them and with George Robinson, the Murrays, Lackington, and all the rest in the next Inseam Measuring episode. Remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? And so, until the next one, cheers.